So welcome everyone. We'll get started between 3 and 5 past the hour. Um, Looking forward to today's webinar with Collide and special guest Nick Lynch. So if you got a couple minutes, if you want to go grab something to drink or get comfortable, and then we'll start. All right, why don't we get started? So today's webinar is with Collide, and the talk title or webinar title is From Resistance to Resilience: The Human-Centered Approach to Change. So our agenda is we'll just quickly go over rules of engagement. We'll just do a very brief industry perspective, and then Collide will present, and then we'll have a roundtable and Q&A discussion. And this is where I hope the audience gets involved and shares their opinions, their experiences, etc. So put your questions or comments in the chat or the Q&A box, either or. We'll monitor those. We will address all those questions during the Q&A session. Even if you have to leave, put them in there. We'll answer them, and you can come back to the recording and see what folks said or answered, how they answered your questions. And like I mentioned, it will go on demand afterwards, so you can come back and watch this at your leisure or over and over and over again. Okay, so a brief industry perspective from us. We're old. We've been in the industry for a while, so we've seen some things. But I wanted to start with just some ground truth type of quotes that famous people over the years have written about change. So without change, there's no innovation, creativity, or incentive for improvement. Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself or themselves. Um, it's actually a very powerful statement. All of them are. That's why I chose them. The first step toward change is awareness. The second step is acceptance. If you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. Change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. And actually, that one is, I really like that quote because it actually is a struggle. And I found in life, if people don't struggle through things, they really never learn how to achieve or how to get there. So that's a really good quote as well. And then the world hates change, yet is the only thing that has brought progress. And it's very similar to the first one. So many people in that are change management professionals or change agents, they work within frameworks that maybe their organization or their companies have adopted. And then maybe what they'll do is tweak those based on experiences, lessons learned, etc. And I think today what you're going to hear is that there might even be a whole nother side of of this where the human side come in and actually even help things be more effective. So in our experience, it's a leadership, culture, and then the actual management of the change that makes things successful. You really have to have a proper culture of and change culture to get things done. And it's very, as we all know on this call, it's very difficult at times to bring people along that refuse or resist change. And when it is successful, many times those people become your biggest champions. That's when you know you succeeded. So Mary Beth is the founder and CEO of Collide. It's an R&D IT consulting firm based in Cambridge, Mass, serving the scientific community since 2014. Collide supports biopharmaceutical clients by implementing innovative R&D IT solutions and works with vendors to develop software offerings. The firm delivers consulting services across life science R&D, clinical, and quality areas, specializing in software implementations, project management, training, and data migration. She holds an MBA from Babson College and a master's in biophysical chemistry from Yale, with nearly 20 years of experience in software product management and business development. DK is a strategy and operations advisor at Collide, specializing in organizational transformation consulting for over a decade. Since joining in 2018, she has helped teams drive user adoption and system and process improvements. She previously held leadership roles at Yale's Global Health Leadership Institute, Accenture's health management consulting practice, and a national home healthcare coordination firm. With a background in journalism and international affairs, her career focuses on cross-cultural collaboration and strategic communications in health and biotech. DK's global health research has been published in Global Health Promotion, BMG Open, and Social Science in Medicine. Nick Lynch from Curlew Research, he's the founder and data lead there. He has over 25 years experience in life science informatics and was at AstraZeneca leading teams in R&D informatics, working especially on global integration and data projects with preclinical and early clinical research, externalization, and data exchange for the AZ research activities. He now runs Curlew Research, supporting biopharma with their data strategy, AI, ML, and informatics challenges. With all of our projects, feel the business change is a key element as important as the technology, data, and processes. And with that, I want to turn it over to Mary Beth and DK.
Just want to check that folks can see that.
Now we can. You're good to go.
Mary Beth, I'll hand it to you to kick us off.
Sure. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. So today we're here to discuss our approach to change management and some of the challenges and projects that we've worked on in the industry over the years. Topics we'll cover today. So a little bit about Collide, who we are, a little bit of background about kind of the core concepts that are used in change management circles. And then we'll go directly into discussing some case studies, and then that'll be followed by a panel discussion and Q&A, and we hope you'll participate in that and share your questions. A little bit about Collide. We like to say that we drive technology adoption to deliver business outcomes and get it right the first time. So we do a lot of work in the upfront part of the SDLC, doing business analysis, supporting the change in the business transformation, but also doing project management, training and delivery, technical documentation. In addition, we also do data migration and testing and validation. So we have a full suite of professional services, and I'm really happy to be here today with my colleague, DK Ciccone, who is our strategy and operations lead and also supports organizational transformation projects.
All right, thank you. So I guess let's get into it now. I think it's important in a conversation like this, since we're all coming from different areas and backgrounds, to make sure we're all on the same page about what we mean when we say change management, in terms of how we're defining it. So at Collide, we're talking about a structured approach, where we're trying to prepare organizations for the effects of a business transformation that's impacting a system or process or both. I actually, on a personal note, kind of dislike the phrase change management because I believe it gives this sort of false hope that you can, in fact, manage change, when ultimately what we're talking about is human behavior in aggregate, which, as we all know, is very difficult to predict. And I think COVID certainly taught us a lot about that. So there is a framework for sort of how we lay out our projects that I think is probably consistent across many of the standard frameworks that are out there. We have kind of 4 phases that we consider. The first being assessment, where you're trying to define future state versus current state. You're documenting and talking to your stakeholders, figuring out what they need, and then understanding, okay, how complex is this change? What's happening in the background? Then there's some design. This can be a short or a long process, depending on how complex the change itself is. And then, of course, you're establishing, okay, how are we going to measure the success of this engagement? And then execution is the long bit. That's where we're actually interacting with folks, taking in continuous feedback, looking to make adjustments as needed. And then when we get to the actual, point of the change, there may be many points of change if it's the kind of program where we're rolling out change in a phased way. But there's always that kind of element of the after, which we don't want to forget, which is making sure that we're giving information that helps people feel successful in the new way of working, but also celebrates the things that are going right and kind of brings that back into the process in case we have to start again, which sometimes, especially with large complex programs, we need to do that. I think those things are pretty consistent across frameworks, as I said. So I think what's interesting to think about is that change management, really is only kind of been a viable discipline that everyone has really heard of in the past decade or so. And I think as a result of that, there's a lot of organizations. We used to be in the position of having to prove to organizations that change management was even needed. I think now most leadership understands that change management is an important part of making a process or system change stick. But what we haven't kind of cracked is making sure that the methodology that we're using is actually effective. And as a result, there's been sort of this proliferation, I think, of really prescriptive, rigid frameworks that have this kind of false promise of, follow our step-by-step guide and out pops a newly functioning person in the new normal at the end of it. And what we've seen time and again is it's just really not that smooth. And I think folks at the end sometimes feel like, okay, I must have misused the framework, or there must have been some aspect of this that we didn't get right. And so they kind of keep harping on the same methodology, really in a strict kind of mindset. But the reality is that humans are just unpredictable, beings. And, there's only so much you can do with a template. And we love the idea that if you are gathering data all the while, that if you have, really strong metrics that you're gathering, that you can sort of predict how long it's going to take or what is needed to get folks to that place of being a champion of the new future state. All those templates and automation simply cannot replace what human to human behavior can build, which is, influence, trust, motivation, and inspiration. And those are really important ingredients to getting people really to be championing a new state of being inside an organization. And so we want to just talk about how do we have the best of both worlds? How do we make sure the human is at the center, even though we are using the best that technology has to offer? So we have a quick poll for you. Which is how often have you observed technology implementation failures stemming from inadequate change management? Okay. Okay, so we didn't have any always. I wasn't sure. But that's really great to see. So we got kind of a variety across the spectrum, but at least folks to some degree are seeing that, change management is still not necessarily hitting the mark when it comes to implementation of technology and process. So what we're going to do is talk through a few quick case studies um, from our portfolio of clients where we've managed organizational transformation. And some of the takeaways here that we felt could really be generalized across industries as kind of standard learnings for change management, and kind of how we can then take that away, hoping you get some kind of actionable things you can use from this conversation and to bring us into our discussion later. So the first lesson learned, silence does not equal adoption, came from a situation where we were managing the change management work stream for a global sample management system that was being implemented for about 500 users in multiple countries, replacing existing regional software and processes. And I think this scenario is really familiar for a lot of large organizations, because this kind of push to move from the homegrown kind of local systems to something that's global, that is often sort of lowest common denominator and has a lot of people kind of missing out on some functionality. That's a really common theme across industries. And the particular obstacle here is that the platform that was being implemented actually had the same name as another platform that was being used elsewhere in the organization. And what we didn't realize about this is that there was a lot of overlap in the user base. So what happened is that we sent out a bunch of emails announcing this change. We invited folks to meetings and to trainings and so on. And we just really weren't hearing a lot of pushback. And so I think there was a lot of temptation to reach back and think, oh, we've nailed it. We've nailed change management. We're not hearing anything from anyone. It must be great. And what we learned at the point at which the system went live is that a whole bunch of folks started writing into the IT department saying, where's my platform? What happened? And they had just been deleting the emails about the notice of the new system change, assuming it was about the other platform that was elsewhere in the organization and not really paying close attention. And I think in addition to just being sort of a kind of a statement about what we hope is the reality and may not be, it's also just such a human thing. I mean, how many of us have sort of scanned our inboxes and just been like, oh, it's not for me, it's not for me, it's not for me, because we get bombarded all day long. And I think this is just like a really real dilemma about the volume of email that a person receives these days on a daily basis. So some of the takeaways here is really about the assessment phase. So making sure that you understand concurrent initiatives and kind of things that could throw a wrench into your plan that may be far outside the bounds of the project itself. And so we really try to cast a wide net there and have as much input as we can. And then making sure that we're really talking to the right level of folks. And this is going to come up often. I think it's a common learning inside our change initiatives is that, sometimes we think we have the right people at the table who are representing the user groups, and it turns out they just aren't close enough to the people who are actually going to turn the system on day one. And so in this particular case, I think there was an expectation that things were going to be smooth, but we were really speaking to a subset of the user group and didn't have as much insight as we thought we did. And then, if you're not hearing anything, I'm sorry to say something probably is wrong. If anyone has another scenario where it was smooth sailing, I would love to hear it. But I just think in general, there's a natural part of this process, which is that humans resist change. And I think it's important to say that that's not a failing of the human experience, right? It's just, a survival instinct to resist change. And so we expect folks to have some kind of response. And so we don't hear something, we're probably missing the mark in one way or another. So the next lesson learned here is related to a very similar scenario, except the scale was significantly larger. So here we're talking about thousands of users of a laboratory informatics platform that was used daily. So we always, when we do our complexity scoring in our programs, we always ask, how often the system is being used, because something that you're going to pick up every 30 days or so, where you have to read the quick start guide anyway, you're not going to have as much resistance to something where you feel really productive and quick inside the system, and that is kind of tied to your job. And so there was definitely a huge complexity to this program, and it was multi-year. And so again, going from something local, something that was custom built to meet the needs of very specific business processes, to something that was, plain vanilla, kind of everyone needed to be harmonized in a global system. And again, very common scenario we're running into when it comes to change management of recent years. So this particular obstacle, and because this program was large, it was complex, and it reached many different geographical areas, we could have pulled many different learnings from this one, but felt that this particular learning related to deployment was of probably the most generalizable qualities into other areas. So users were getting sort of blindsided. They would suddenly get a notice, it was 30 days or something. Guess what? You're getting your new system. Here's the training. Please go forward. But what we were hearing from the users on the change management side is that felt like a real, a shock to them. And that's really not an experience we want in change management. We want people to be along for the ride, right? That's a big part of doing this successfully. So because change management and the deployment teams were operating separately from each other, we didn't really have an opportunity to influence each other. But we really had to bring that back to the program leadership and say, hey, folks are asking a lot of questions and they want more insight into when to expect the change to hit their groups. What can we do? And so in this case, we actually revamped the whole deployment approach such that we had a cross-functional group or sort of committee that was managing from 75 to 90 days in advance of each transition. And there were many, it was phased. So that we had a checklist that touched all the different groups. And historically, they would have done this very separately, where sort of making sure that folks were loaded in for being able to log in on first day was being handled differently from, do we have your business area specific, training slides? But we just found it was really effective to bring everyone together into one sort of roundtable. And then we met every 30 days through the course of transition and checked off the boxes. And we made sure that the local area groups were sitting in those meetings and could be sort of tuned into what was happening. They didn't feel like there was a sort of secret meeting happening without them. And they could kind of weigh in if there was something coming up that was going to be, really make the transition problematic for their group, and we could deal with the problem as it arose. So, here we really had this learning, and I think this has also borne out in many different programs, but this one it was just very obvious that change management is not just something you execute off to the side, a framework that you apply like icing on the cake. It has to be baked in. It has to be woven into everything about the program itself for it really to be effective. And that's where we really start to, as John was mentioning earlier, if you have a culture of change where everyone understands they have a role to play, now you can actually start to execute with more efficiency and speed because everyone can participate in taking the feedback, adapting, understanding the user's perspective. So our takeaways here was to take the change management strategy and bring it all the way into program setup and execution and make sure that we were integrated into decision making at the top. We also needed to be prepared to adapt the delivery approach to accommodate stakeholder needs. And when you're in a large program situation where you have multiple partners with different scope, that's challenging. And in this case, we did have that, right? So the other partner managing deployment was what had fall under a different, oversight and so on. And so we really needed to collaborate on that. And then collecting stakeholder feedback often and making it both formal and informal is so important. So many of our clients really want to limit the communications aspect of a change management approach to just the pushing out and not so much the hearing. But when people can express what they're feeling and then we can acknowledge that we heard them and this is what we're doing as a result, it's so incredibly impactful. And we really just smoothed out the bumps in the road by changing the way deployment was being managed. And it actually made us more efficient. It's not like it, even though we had a couple more meetings, it actually meant we were getting together instead of working in silos. So in the end, it was actually good for the program. And then leveraging peer groups, making sure that we're getting the information from folks who are actually arm in arm with the people who are experiencing the change, which was a takeaway from our first case study as well. Okay. Our third case study here is about one size doesn't fit all when it comes to R&D applications. So, I think you could probably say one size doesn't fit all, ... and finish with many different things. But in this case, I think this is another common scenario where we were moving a host of applications that were being managed on-prem to a global cloud management, service that was external to the organization. And they had a very ambitious goal of moving hundreds in less than a year. And then at the same time, trying to make sure there was no disruption to the business, that, data security was handled sufficiently and so on. So there was quite a lot of technical complexity to this project, which again, was being built and managed outside of any consideration for the change management. And in this particular case, because of the scale and the strategic nature, leadership had purchased a solution that included an automated migration tool with kind of emails that pushed out at a certain periodic rate, letting people know they had a task they had to complete. And the expectation was that this was going to make the transition for applications really fast. And there was going to be high rates of adoption because it's so simple and so streamlined, and you're not going to need to bring in a bunch of people to manage it. But it just didn't land. Folks were receiving, again, emails from an outside group they hadn't really ever heard of before. The requests were super complex. They would click into the system and then it turned out they needed a login, and then they get booted out, and then they, would kind of, a ticket would come up and they'd move on with their day. So people had the best of intentions to be compliant. But there was just a big disconnect between the folks who had made some decisions about what was going to be leveraged from a technical perspective, and then how it was actually being received from the application owners and product owners themselves, who, let's be honest, are most of the time overwhelmed and overworked and, running tight on time, and are often being driven by issues and bugs and kind of high priority things where something like a migration might take a back seat. So this project was churning quite a lot when we got involved. Ultimately, what we ended up doing is having sort of a hybrid of, keeping the automation, but having a one-on-one meeting with each of the product owners to kind of walk them through and introduce them to the tool and explain any questions they had, make sure that we connected internal folks as well as the folks who represented the solution itself, but also making sure that we really made it clear why this project was important. You know, the huge savings that was going to be enabled as a result of this maintenance shift to a global application hosting situation. And, you know, why that would ultimately, though it was a big lift in the short term, hopefully free up some of these product owners to have more time. And so the so what, right? The what's in it for me was really missing in the beginning. So in terms of our major takeaways, um, particularly in light of the focus of this talk, automation without explanation can actually be more work. It isn't always that panacea we hope it's going to be, especially when you're talking about something that is an effect looking to affect behavior change within humans. So we need to figure out how to connect the dots between making a really strategic global leadership decision and then also seeing things through the needs of the folks who are going to have to then action that decision and making sure it makes sense and fits into the day-to-day work of that group. And, you know, drawing the lines between the two is not just like a thing that happens in one moment. It often requires, you know, multiple approaches. And then designing with the user in mind. So, you know, we already know that when it comes to our designing our technology and our requirements gathering processes, we always want to be meeting the user's needs. But we also need to be meeting the user's needs for the way that we define the way that we're going to actually look at change. It's not that, you know, we always talk about, for example, if you already have forums where communications are being delivered, use the ones you have. You know, just kind of arbitrarily tacking on an additional thing that people have to pay attention to is actually burdening them more. We want to make change easy. We want to remove the roadblocks. Um, and that's a huge part of making sure that change management approaches actually fit the solution you're trying to drive. So I love the thumbs up. Thank you. So I'll try to get us to summary here, because I'm sure we'd love to have some conversation about this. We wanted to summarize. I think the takeaways had a lot of overlap. So there's three key themes that we really try to focus on at Collide and our organizational transformation consulting. One is don't skimp on the assessment phase. And we actually recently released a blog on this topic because of all the phases of change management, it is the one I think we see clients really try to skip or just kind of, you know, talk to a couple people and then let's just get going, right? Again, all with the best of intentions. But when you don't understand all the factors inside the landscape that could actually derail you later, it's actually really going to cause you a lot of extra work down the road. So building in that time at the start of like, how are we designing the program to make sure that it actually doesn't disrupt people's lives too much? How do we make sure that all aspects of readiness are being drawn into the fold so we're not suddenly realizing we have a quality risk, you know, 7/8 of the way down? That assessment phase is absolutely key, and you will be glad you made that investment. And then do design from the end user's perspective. We want to avoid echo chambers by actually allowing unfiltered feedback in and make it easy for people. And we want to put ourselves in their shoes. How are we inadvertently erecting roadblocks in front of people to change? How can we actually just make the path simpler? Sometimes that's far more, most of the time, I'd say far more effective than trying to make an elaborate, you know, Candyland path to the future state. And then do adapt. It's so hard when you're held to a tight timeline and you feel that, you know, pressure to deliver. It can be really scary to agree to make shifts in your program along the way based on what you hear. But ultimately, we're talking about human behavior, and we're talking about trying to get people to a new way of working, and we need to be prepared to support that and kind of figure out a way to. We don't have all the answers, but I think we want to have conversations on how we figure out a way to adapt in a way that's not disruptive to the program itself. And that's a continuous improvement mindset that doesn't always fit, a strict timeline for a technology program. So we'll close with just one more request for your input about which of those takeaways resonates with you and would you think have the greatest impact in your work at the moment. Yeah, that assessment phase. That's so true. Great. Great. Well, thank you so very much, and really excited to move on to the discussion part. I'll hand it back to you, John.
Sounds great. Great job. There's a lot to unpack there. You brought up a couple different things. Let's see if we can get some questions from the audience to get things started. One thing that you brought up too, while we're waiting for some of this to come in, are the personas. How important that is actually in the assessment phase to identify the different personas. Is that something that you guys can try to elaborate on? And do you agree with that? And if so, what are some thoughts around the different personas and how you address them?
Yeah, so we try to take a look at, the full spectrum of people who are going to be impacted by a change. And where we find the gap usually resides is in the fact that there are people downstream in a process or upstream in a process who are not actually at the table or even in consideration when it comes to the change itself. So let's say you're putting in a system, and today's system actually has outside vendor partners who access your system or maybe receive a report from you, and now their process is going to change. It's really hard to anticipate some of those more extraneous impacts. And so, we do assessment, and that's interview based usually for stakeholders. But I think in particular, it's like that step before, which is to say, not just the people inside those circle you've already drawn, but who are people who are dependent on the work that you're doing now, who could get missed if we don't, take them into consideration at this point.
Nick or Mary Beth, you want to comment on any of that? Any thoughts?
Yeah, no, first of all, great presentation, DK. I think definitely on the persona, I'm literally just working on some persona for a project now and trying to think. Your point about working upstream and downstream, I think, is very well made in the sense that you might have physical persona that are engaged in the project, but both upstream and downstream persona could well be impacted. And we like to use just classic post-its or depending on how you go about identifying persona, in terms of you're asking existing persona to try and think of others, but equally making sure that the persona are representative, that have both enough coverage, but equally aren't too specific. Because I think that, sometimes you have to, you can't have maybe too many persona, but that maybe is a discussion point to have.
Okay.
And
Go ahead,
I
Mary
think we've
Beth.
also, I would just add to that. I think we've also seen situations where the stakeholders certainly weren't necessarily users, but it was very important that they were aware of the change and they had a direct impact. And, if we didn't communicate to that group, it really would have been disruptive to their work because they rely on a report or some piece of information that comes down later on. So those are always, I think that's why the assessment phase is so critical, because it's at that point in time where you can cast a wide net and think about who are all the people, not just who are going to be interacting with this technology, but who may be impacted by this change that we're making.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. I think a lesson learned that we recently saw too was, hey, we're so busy, we're a stakeholder persona. We're so busy, we totally trust everything you guys are doing. Go do it. And then what happened was you'd go all and do it, and then you'd spend 4 weeks being questioned why you're doing certain things. So if they were involved, if that persona was involved in the project, instead of saying we don't have time to be, the project would have gotten delivered in 50% of the time. So these are all like little things that pop out with different personas and involvement. Um,
Yeah.
it's
So we often will, sorry, I'm sorry, John. Did you have another
no, no,
thought?
no, go, go, go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we often, when we go into a program and we're in the initial scoping phases, we'll say, okay, who are the folks that are receiving this? Who are the folks that need to be a part of the conversation? And has their current line manager agreed to reduce their workload by 15, 20% so that they can participate in the needed meetings? Because it's one thing to say we're ready to have this strategic change. It's another thing to say we're ready to remove, a quarter of the productivity of our people so that they can actually implement the change. And I think organizations, when we talk about that, readiness for change, kind of checklist, one of the things you need to be ready to do is actually alleviate people's time so that things like what you're describing can be mandatory because you just have to be part of it.
Yeah. How about when you're handed a project that's flawed from the beginning? And so, we're all under tough times now, we're like taking projects on, but what if our client did not do a good job of framing out the project, designing the project, and requirements, assessments, all that. And you realize as you get into the project, you're like, oh my gosh, this change management can almost be impossible because what they've handed us is almost going to fail just because they designed the project wrong. How do you manage that scenario?
I mean, I
Is it
think
even
that's
a
the case
realistic
a lot of,
scenario?
yeah, that's the case a lot of the time. And it's not, I mean, what you're describing is sort of, the fatal flaw. I mean, I think most programs are built by humans, and so humans are not perfect, and it's hard to foresee all of the things, and everyone has competing agendas. So, I mean, there are many reasons why a program may have some flaws from the beginning, but um, I think change management is often in a position to see the cracks as they're appearing because if we're the ones delivering the message to the folks who are the ones experiencing the change, they may be. I think the biggest risk we see is sort of either I wasn't involved in the choice and so it's being handed to me, or I wanted a different choice and I'm not sure why they went with this choice and it's complete conflict with what everybody wanted. And so we are at least empowered at that point to bring that information back to the program and say, here's what we're hearing in terms of the change challenge, and it seems like it's a result of, some difficulty in the setup of the program itself. But I mean, I don't think we've ever been in a situation where we would then turn around and, try to back the program out of existence. Um, but that's a tough thing.
Yeah, and
I
I was
suppose.
just going to add, I think too, I think, that comment that change management is not a work stream, it's a way of working. I think in some of these programs, having people like project managers and business analysts, maybe you don't have the budget for a change manager, but if they have training in change management and they understand what to look for, having those resources primed with some, easy resources, checklists, things to keep an eye out for when you're managing and navigating change, because I think all project managers should have some basic understanding, of that. And we do see sometimes that isn't an investment the organization is making, but you want to bring in project managers who also have an eye for change and can monitor things as they come up. I think that's also a critical point.
And I
Okay.
suppose to build on that scenario, it's also about thinking about the risk of not raising those things. I think DK made a good point about, how early do you need to think about change? Because you have to really, as with many things, think about the cost of not doing something right. Just the same would apply to not getting your data in a good shape. It has both immediate cost or risk and equally long-term risk. So as was said, I suppose a change thinking is hopefully, is mitigating risks. It may not mitigate all of them, but you're trying to prioritize which ones you're trying to mitigate.
Okay. Here's a question that came in. I love that DK highlights the availability of necessary resources. How have you dealt with resistance of line managers freeing up team members' time if they don't see the assessment as a must-have, but a nice-to-have?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's our job at that point to kind of convince them why the assessment is so important. And, usually we would use examples of where assessments have not been robust and the cost that was incurred as a result in the end, where we've had to roll back change. Nobody wants that, because when you've gone through all the effort of pushing through a change and then you have to pull it back, talk about making your change management job harder the second time around, right? Because again, it's about trust. So I think once usually people are receptive when they kind of can understand the risks associated with not doing the assessment. Um, I think there's some negotiating in terms of, okay, so maybe 25% of their time being freed up is not realistic, but here's the number of hours we really need to have them in workshops, and can we make sure they have a backup, and can they delegate to someone else in their team, and just making sure we have that coverage. And that's of course a scenario where, as Mary Beth pointed out, like we actually have the ability to influence the program design from a change management lens. We may not even be in a situation where the program leadership is actually ready to hear that kind of input from us, but we do try to lay it out as an assumption in terms of delivering the change management work stream. We hope that our partners on the requirements development side are also as emphatically, arguing on behalf of having people's time and things like that as well, because it's the same people usually who are throughout the whole program, and there is a cost associated with that. I don't think we've really ever had anybody kind of 100% deny that that is a need. They may just try to negotiate down on what the time is. I don't know if you guys have other thoughts.
Yeah, and I would just adding having that leadership buy-in is so critical, because if you don't have that buy-in, you have no basis for negotiation. So making sure everybody's aligned on why we're doing this and what the commitment should be. And yeah, there could be a negotiation, but at the end, you have to have um, that buy-in from the leadership team.
I mean, just to build on that, I mean, I think equally, although we're talking about change, I would also sort of think about sustainability in the sense that even after what you might call the implementation project, that there's a very high likelihood that you need stakeholders and persona involved in the sustaining of whatever we're talking about. If it's informatics tools, you're likely to need sort of, domain specific product owners, or depending on, the sort of the language you use. But I would say that, yeah, it's a natural progression, both as we're talking about change, but to think about the importance of, subject experts, people that are actually within that workflow, to be involved for the period that application or process is actually running. So it's preparing it for sustainability. I would see it as.
Good point.
Okay, here's another question from Brian. What are the primary reasons for resistance to technology transformations, and what strategies can be employed to overcome them?
I think it boils down to people wanting to feel good at their jobs. And, when you're using, especially a system that you're using every day, all day, and you feel, you think about the up, how long it takes to feel comfortable in a system where you can kind of navigate it without having to think too hard about it. You suddenly you're slowed down, your productivity decreases. You feel like you can't, you don't feel like a high performer. I just think that that's the major concern for most people. But then also it's almost never technology change with no strings attached. It's often technology change on the heels of an acquisition, or technology change on the heels of all the buzz about AI and like, automation taking jobs or whatever. So I think ultimately there's usually something else happening in the background that folks are reacting to. It's not like, again, like I don't think people are inherently just putting up walls to change just to be difficult. I think that there's either a sense of insecurity, a fear, there's, general just volatility in the environment that is generally the reason that we find the resistance. And most people are pretty reasonable once they have the information they need to be successful.
And just to add to that, I think one thing that we found effective in our stakeholder needs assessment phase is when we ask people about the kind of the peripheral things going on in the organization. Is there a reorg? Are jobs changing? Are there major things happening while this change is also occurring? And so being cognizant of that, and even just doing simple things like understanding major dates and why certain dates wouldn't be good, being respectful of that has been really helpful for us in being successful with moving the transformations along.
Nick, do you want to add any of that?
I think, I mean, it comes back to, if we're thinking about if it's the question related to technology sort of adoption or changes, it's again trying to phrase it in the way of what's the benefit, in terms of change, it's trying to express some of these benefits that hopefully are, that can address the concerns of that particular stakeholder or persona type. So it's trying
Yeah.
to, and equally, as you say, be clear about if there are potential negatives, which maybe is associated with the change, having some answers to that, to go through that conversation. So, and the earlier that you do that, the better, because hopefully it actually then improves, as was said, these conversations with persona and impacted people are very likely to improve the final adoption because you're having the conversations as early as possible.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think DK said it earlier too. What's in it for me? Those approaches, what's in it for me or my team or the company need to be very clear and crisp. And I think too, the technology transformations aren't just, there is no such thing as just a singular transformation. The science is affected, the people are affected, the processes, you go down the line and you realize, ooh, a transformation is actually a big change with a lot of tentacles attached to it. So be prepared when you get into that a lot of different things are going to get touched.
There's definitely a difference too between, I mean, I've been involved in, implementing a system that's genuinely going to make someone's life better, even if it's, I have 10 extra clicks today, but like in 6 months, I'll have automated data and analytics and instrument integration or whatever. People can get behind that. But a lot of the programs we've been seeing lately, where it's really just feels like it's companies addressing their tech debt and they're kind of having to move servers or they're going to a cloud migration, like we were talking about before, where they're going to a harmonized platform to mitigate risk of auditing and things. There's often no benefit to the actual user. It's a budgeting benefit maybe, or it's a maintenance or risk issue at the leadership level, and those are definitely harder to sell. I think, like you said, if people will generally, if they're interested in their company culture, they will get behind the idea that like this is going to help us serve patients better. This is going to help us achieve the values of the organization better, even if there's not like a daily benefit of, I will be able to achieve my job faster. But it is definitely a different animal in those two things.
I think cultures come up a couple times today. How do we or how do you create or help companies create that culture that embraces change or um, you know starts things from a more cultural perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with making sure that everyone in the organization understands change management as a discipline, and kind of is brought into the fold of why we're doing various things. I think companies sometimes feel like not sharing things too early is a way of reducing confusion. But a lot of times what we find is that employees just feel like they're being left out, or there's sort of I always say that in the absence of information, people come up with their own story. So if we know a big change is coming, but we're not getting the details yet because it's not fully baked, there's just like people will kind of come up with all kinds of things in their mind. And so I think a culture of transparency generally is really productive. Um, yeah, and I think a lot of the things, the ingredients that are really important are organizational culture and nature, and not necessarily things we can influence on a project level. I'm curious what others think.
Yeah, I would just add to that though, that I think there is a cultural geographic component that different cultures have different ways of
Mm.
accepting information. So, in some cultures, it's really important to have all the details before you communicate. In other cultures, you can be more transparent. So I think really relying on those local resources is so critical in working with them to understand how that information is going to land, and working with those individuals and SMEs to make sure it's delivered in an appropriate cultural context is so critical for success. So it may be a little bit different depending on the geography or the culture, and I think that's
Yeah,
okay.
good point. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I
I think
think
you're spot on.
I was
Sorry,
going
Nick.
to add about, where particularly where people's first language isn't English as well, but that there's an element of needing to, their English might be fantastic, but it's having the spending the time to explain it in maybe different ways. And and many, I suppose, biopharma are multinational with, cutting across US, Europe, Asia as well, that having different and making time for them, because often you have to,
Hmm.
meet them in the middle, or at least very much to their side in terms of time zones for meetings and all of that, to be cognizant of how how they interact with the different geographics.
Yeah, people definitely feel that when like the meetings are being set at a time zone that's consistently inconvenient for them. So there's something to be said for, kind of sharing the burden of time zone differences and how that just creates a sense of a more egalitarian sort of working workplace. But I mean, not to veer into organizational culture, but that's a whole other topic, a whole other webinar.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is. Inclusion in that setup is so critical to get it right, right? So I agree. Maybe it'll be that webinar in the near future. Um, how do we measure all this? How do we measure the effectiveness of change management, etc.? Did it work? How do you do it?
Go ahead, Mary Beth. I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the things that DK really championed in our organization was building out surveys, and the same survey that's given over over certain periods of time. And you look at the data over time to see how the usage of the system has evolved, how the attitude towards the system has evolved. Of course, there's also easy key metrics you can measure in terms of the number of time, if it's technology, if people are actually using the system, and just looking at how many times they are relying on it, if they're not using their old system, if that's even a possibility. Looking at some of those metrics is always useful, but I think surveying has been a really effective tool for us, but specifically looking at the same data, quarter to quarter, and looking back. We did that on one of the big global projects that we just talked about in the case study, that over time has revealed a lot of changes in the way the users are interacting with the system, and feedback that's been very valuable, not just for change management, but also product development, and what's important to the users in terms of the feature set that we need to prioritize going forward.
Okay. Here's one last
Yeah,
question.
okay.
Okay, go ahead, DK. No, keep going. We got
I was
time.
just gonna throw out there, it's like a one-liner, but I always say that I much prefer noisy, resistant, angry users to apathetic, quiet ones, because we can really work with people who are resistant and are telling us. Because I feel like when you're telling people what you're frustrated about, you still have hope that it can be better. And so that to me is a sign that actually we're making progress with people. I know that sounds kind of funny, but the surveys obviously are great to measure that. But like when you're having a dialogue and you can shift and you get feedback constantly that things are working, that to me is a functioning, it's like a relationship. It's a functioning system. And ultimately after your change has come, folks should be able to feel successful. And that's really what we want to aim for and making sure we get them there. Go ahead.
It's just a question around change. So like if you're going from say system A to system B, but you know that system A is in today's world where there's challenges around system A has everything in it and does everything, but now we need to go to the cloud and the new cloud version only has 25% of the functionality. So we're not taking them from a functional 100% to 100% plus. It's actually less than what they're used for. How have you managed that change over time? Because that's actually a reality, and it can be detrimental to the end users.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see that pretty consistently. And,
Yeah,
usually we're able to talk about either there's a data integrity risk or an intellectual property reason for protecting data and why we're going to a global standardized approach. But I actually wonder, to be really frank with you, that if some of those decisions are actually going to get rolled back. Like, I wonder how many of these actually moving to a global system program decisions are going to turn out that the juice wasn't worth the squeeze in terms of the budget that they got, but all the noise that it created inside their users. But
this is a big lesson learned, I think, and I think I know. Should have waited till the end here to ask it, but Mary Beth, what are your thoughts? I know you. I can see smoke coming out of your ears, so I know you're thinking.
No, I mean, it's never easy. I think you have to play the long game if you are, I mean, if you are really promoting something where people are going to lose out on their day-to-day function, you have to help them understand why they're doing it and what the larger organizational context and goals are. But that doesn't mean it also can't fail and be rolled back, as GK mentioned. I mean, anything's
Right.
possible. So I think it's
But is
really
there a
important.
magic number in there, Mary Beth? Is there like 50% of functionality, 75%? Like, where is it like no return? Like, there's no way we can make up all this work in 3 years or 5 years. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really tough question. It probably matters who the persona is, coming back to that.
Yeah,
Who
and
does it
what the
hurt?
benefits are, like, what are we doing it for? If there's a huge
right.
benefit down the line, like I'm going to get automated robots at the end, maybe I'll be more apt to accept the reduction.
Right, right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, believe it or not, we're at the top of the hour. So folks are going to have to go to their next meeting or go eat lunch or whatever. But want to thank everybody for this conversation. We could have many more of these. I think they're worth it. It'll save clients millions of dollars in failure. That's for sure. So want to thank Collide and Nick from Curlew Research for today. And I think everybody did a great job. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.